Hi, my name is Holly. Each month I do a topic of history that's of interest, I hope, to all of you. This month it's on 1776. And that's a broader topic than I realized. I realized it was a whole year, but I could have done this over 12 months. But I'll do my best to condense it. I know I'll miss some important things, but maybe it will inspire you to do more research. And of course, this is the Second Continental Congress, the colorized version that's behind me. And there were no women there. I am going to give you an overall timeline. I don't want to miss anything, but this is an engraving that was done by Paul Revere, published by him. He had a lot of talents. This is one of them. It wasn't quite like that. They weren't lined up like that, but there was a Boston massacre and soldiers from both sides were killed. So the tensions go back quite a ways. Um, so I'll try to summarize this, but the French and Indian War ended. And you're going to find out that this has the greatest impact of anything in starting the Revolutionary War. I'll tell you a little more about that later on. 1765, Britain passes the Stamp Act, and they start taxing legal documents. Taxes are not a popular thing with the colonists. It ends up being repealed thanks to Benjamin Franklin, who probably doesn't get nearly enough credit for being the great statesperson that he was. In 1768, British troops landed in Boston to reinforce the townshend duties. So we got more taxes coming: paint, paper, tea, and they go after the local radicals. A lot of people are not in favor of this. Well, why? Because they do not have any representation. Of course, Great Britain's going to say, we set you up. You're under us, but thanks to us, you are here. Some of you are born here. There's a difference of opinion. That's a very great generalization. There's a big clash between soldiers and the mob in March of 1770 that will leave 5 dead radicals from the colonists, and that's what we'll call it, the Boston Massacre, while the British will call it the incident on King Street. And that's the picture you're seeing there. And it leads to the death of those 5 civilians, including Crispus Atticus, who was a free Black, very well known at the time. Oh, there's just so many things. They try to intimidate the patriots, the people that are not wanting to have taxation without representation. They try to intimidate Massachusetts, and as New Englander, I don't think Massachusetts is easily intimidated, even back then. 1773, in protest, the tea is dumped over the side of the ships into Boston Harbor. Patriots dress as Native Americans. The 1774, the British Parliament passes the Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts in America. It wasn't America then, but you know what I mean. Britain closes the port of Boston and requires British troops to be housed in taverns and vacant buildings. That was not popular, and Massachusetts is stripped of its rights, leading to the First Continental Congress. So they went after Massachusetts. Let's just skip down here. Patrick Henry says, give me liberty or give me death. I'll talk about some of these, but not all of them. Paul Revere's ride. The war breaks out in April of 1775. Shots are fired at Lexington and Concord. Here's an interesting one. 1775, Britain forms an alliance with patriot slaves. The British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any slaves of rebellious Americans who can enter British lines. Throughout the war, thousands of African Americans will seek freedom because the British supported giving them that to get them to enlist. A very small number will fight on the patriot side, the side of independence, because they discourage enlistment. The Battle of Bunker Hill, which you will find is really not Bunker Hill. It's actually Breed's Hill. And then common sense comes out. I'll talk about how that influences Thomas Jefferson. South Carolinians repelled British attempt to take Charleston. And wow, I just talked about Charleston when I did Fort Wagner. And I did not focus a lot on the South because this is but there is a lot happening there during the war as well. So I want to mention this part. A British invasion force initiates an all-day attack on a Patriot force on Sullivan's Island. Invaders are unable to land their troops on the island, and the waters of Charleston Harbor frustrate the British Navy. The British retire in defeat, and South Carolina will remain untouched by the British for 3 more years. But if you want to get an idea, it's very fictionalized, but my husband and I have been rewatching the movie The Patriot. But there's a lot that happens in the South during the American Revolutionary War, including in 1776. I do not focus on that, but I am very aware of it. I could do another whole presentation on that. And we have July 4th, 1776, that has officially approved the Declaration of Independence. But there's so much more. I just wanted to make sure that anything that I leave out in the overview that I got to mention a little bit here. So Great Britain had a massive debt following the French and Indian War, and it started a global war as well. To help relieve some of the financial burden, they expected the American colonies to pay their share. Beginning in 1763, Great Britain began a series of acts for taxing the American colonies, though it seemed reasonable to the British, considering that they had come to the defense of the colonies in the French and Indian War. Many colonials were irate at the levying of taxes. And you can watch, there's another good movie that I didn't get to rewatch the whole thing this time, but The Last of the Mohegans, we'll talk about that war as well. And it left everybody with a massive debt. And colonials were irate. They didn't want these taxes. From 1763 to 1776, Parliament, King George III, royal governors, and colonists, they all clash over trade, taxation, and representation. They had none. The colonists, the Americans, whatever you want to call them, but many Americans did not want to get in a war. Understandably so. They believed war and independence were a last resort. And you're going to be surprised that not everybody wanted to go to war. By 1775, tensions reached a boiling point. Both sides prepared for war as negotiations continued to fail. Fighting began outside of Boston in the spring of 1775 during a British raid to seize munitions at Lexington and Concord. British Minutemen arrived on Lexington Green on the morning of April 19th and discovered the town's militia awaiting their arrival. The Minutemen intended only a show of force and weren't going to fire a shot. They were disbanding when a shot rang out. And then the American Revolution begins. And it's going to last from 1775 to 1781. Now, yes, I'm focusing on 1776, but I have to give you a little build-up because we just don't plop down in the middle of 1776 without all these things leading to that. Now, the First Continental Congress was a meeting of delegates from 12 of the 13 British colonies. Georgia wasn't able to send anyone. There were things going on there that prohibited that. They gathered in Philadelphia from September 5th to October 26, 1774. Main purpose to coordinate a response to the intolerable acts passed by the British Parliament. During the first weeks, the delegates had a lively discussion about how the colonies could together respond to the British government's strong-arm actions, and they worked to develop a common cause. The Congress's first action was the adoption of the Suffolk Resolves, a measure drawn up by several counties like Suffolk, Massachusetts, that included a declaration of grievances, called for a trade boycott of British goods, and urged each colony to set up and train its own militia. Delegates also debated the rights of the American colonists. There were 56 delegates who met from September 5th to October 26, 1774. The spring of 1775, the war seemed inevitable. Americans weren't yet asking for independence. They just wanted to be treated fairly as British citizens, especially if they were going to be faced with the burden of taxes. They wanted to have a say in the government. Still, tensions were rising, and at the Second Virginia Convention in Richmond on March 23rd, Delegate Patrick Henry delivered a speech that indicated many Americans would resist, and there's a picture of it. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there's no peace, he said. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it. Almighty God, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And I was in Richmond at one time when I saw this reenacted, and it is very moving. And there's a picture of it. In the north, General Gage, the British commander, was growing increasingly concerned about the Americans. They're getting organized, and there's animosity growing, and they have a military arsenal. And he wanted to undermine the Americans' power. And when I say Americans, even though they still thought of themselves as that, but the colonists, the patriots. He ordered a mission to raid their munitions, their arms stockpile in nearby Concord. Colonel Francis Smith and about 1,000 troops made their way west from Boston through the night and into the morning of April 19th, 1775, hoping for a surprise arrival. Will they get it? But news of their approach had been delivered via the colonist intelligence network led by Paul Revere. He did a lot more than just ride on his horse that night, who used lanterns as signals. 2 were displayed in a church steeple to convey that the troops had left Boston via the river, and who rode on horseback to rout the local citizens and militiamen. By the time the redcoats reached Lexington, not long before dawn, a small group of armed colonists were waiting to meet them. The British ordered them to disperse, but they refused. A shot was fired. I mentioned this already. Just another telling of it. It had never been established from which side, though some people say it's the British, some people say it's the Patriots, and it triggered more gunfire, leaving 8 colonists dead. The shot heard around the world was how Ralph Waldo Emerson would commemorate the moment in his 1837 Concord hymn. And of course, the 18th of April in 75 by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, where it says that hardly a man something is now alive that remembers that date and year. Well, now there's no one alive, but it made Paul Revere very well known. And he did a lot of things for patriotism. In 1774 and 1775, the Boston Committee of Correspondence and the Massachusetts Committee of Safety hired Paul Revere as an express writer to carry news, messages, and copies of important documents, sometimes as far away as New York and Philadelphia, sometime between 10 and 11, depending on which viewpoint you take. On April 18, 1775, their best express writer, Paul Revere, set out from Boston, first by rowboat. Did you know that part? I didn't, the rowboat part, or I forgot it. Then horseback to warn throughout the countryside, the same thing I just told you, that the Royal soldiers were marching towards the towns of Lexington and Concord. By dawn on April 19th, these soldiers, the regulars, had reached Lexington. I mean, these are professional soldiers, where they met resistance from local militia. The battles of the American Revolution had begun. Paul Revere saddled his horse in Charlestown, facing the possibility he'd run into British officers who had good horses and were better riders. Soon other riders, such as William Dawes and Dr. Samuel Prescott, alerted by Revere, would spread out on the routes throughout the Lexington area. Now, Dawes does go at the beginning, Dr. Prescott nearer the end. And Paul Revere had a poem, but he was very active in the cause of freedom. It was decided at the First Continental Congress that delegates from the 13 colonies would meet again on May 10th, 1775, beginning at the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress functioned as the national government of the American colonies throughout the Revolutionary War. The delegates were responsible for coordinating the war effort, diplomacy and foreign affairs, issuing currency, economics, budgeting, and other administrative duties. The Second Continental Congress had to keep on moving locations several times during the war. It started at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Eventually, when the British evacuated Philadelphia in 1778, Congress returned to Independence Hall. Congress helped establish spy networks to gather intelligence on British movements and plans. One famous secret agent, Nathaniel Hale, was commissioned by George Washington, and he wasn't experienced. So I don't know if that was the best choice, not to question General Washington, but he was not. He was easily caught. There were other people that perhaps would not have been caught. Do I think he was a patriot? Absolutely. But he's captured and executed by the British, declaring, I only regret that I have one life, but one life to lose for my country. However, and there it is, members of the Union, execution of Nathan Hale on the site of East Broadway, corner of Market Street, New York. However, there are people who believe that he never said this. It wasn't reported till later. So do more reading and see what you think. Did he die in the cause of patriotism? Yes. Did he say it? Maybe. Should somebody else have been chosen? Most likely. On August 23rd, 1775, George III declared that the colonies were in open and avowed rebellion. Washington had assembled his troops and artillery at Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston. The two sides exchanged fire, but the British could not make any significant impact on the American location, with supplies dwindling and little hope of holding off the rebels. General Howe ended the 11-month siege, 11 months of Boston, and refocused his attention on New York, evacuating the city of Boston in March. Go to Boston and walk that Freedom Trail, by the way. And I will tell you, I know some about the Revolution. I am a little more learned about the Civil War, but it's never too late. Keep reading. I hope this inspires you to learn more as well. When the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, delegates, including new delegates Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, voted to form a Continental Army with Washington as its commander-in-chief. On June 17, 1775, the Revolutionary War first major battle. I talked about this several times, but colonial forces inflicted heavy casualties on the British regiment of General Howe. This is not a professional standing army, by the way, at Breed's Hill in Boston. The battle, known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, isn't that ironic, ended in a British victory. The cost of the battle was high, with more than 1,000 British casualties and 450 for the Americans. During the fall and winter, Washington's forces struggled to keep the British contained to Boston, but artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga, New York, helped shift the balance of that struggle in late winter. The British left the city in March 1776, with Howe and his men retreating to Canada because they are going to invade New York. And yes, this picture of Washington is from Valley Forge, and I don't get to 1777, but I couldn't find a good picture of him that was in the public domain. And that would be a great topic itself, Valley Forge. But I wanted you to see a picture of George Washington as general. So on June 15, 1775, John Adams proposed that the Continental Congress choose George Washington, a Virginian, considered the crown jewel of the 13 colonies at that time, to be commander-in-chief. And if you've never visited his home, by the way, Mount Vernon, go. I haven't been a long time, and I'd love to go back. Washington's military experience was greater than any other American at that time, any other patriot. and he came from the largest and perhaps the most important of the Southern colonies. Washington's military experience was greater, but he recognized when he accepted the command that he lacked the necessary experience and knowledge in handling large groups of men. His entire military experience was in the frontier warfare during the French and Indian War, globally known as the 7 Years' War, though he had commanded a brigade of troops from several colonies during the capture of Fort Duquesne. He was the only native-born American at the time to command a force that size. And by the way, there's a movie out called Young Washington, and you can find about him in the French and Indian War. And I'll talk about my presentation for next month later on. On July 3rd, 1775, George Washington mounted his horse and rode into Cambridge, Massachusetts. So the war had already begun to take command of the Continental Army. By the time Washington arrived in Cambridge, the American colonies had been at war with Great Britain for over 2 months. First shots had been fired. And I did not do all the Southern ones, and there's a lot of battles. But I just wanted to briefly touch on that because I didn't want the entire focus to be war. But so many things are happening, and there is a lot of war. Siege of Boston from 11 months. That's American victory. Battle of Long Island, August 27th, 1776, British. Battle of Kips Bay, September 15th, 1776, British victory. Battle of Harlem Heights, American victory. Battle of White Plains, this is all in New York. British victory. Battle of Fort Washington, British victory. Evacuation of Fort Lee, British victory. Battle of Trenton, American victory. Seems a little lopsided. And then there's a ton going on in the South. There's times when this army will be starving. It looks like all hope is lost, but we won at the end. But there's so much more to the story, and I didn't mean to overlook the Southern side. I just didn't have time to put it all in here, but I urge you to read about the battles there and what's going on there as well. And I want to thank my husband for, he's doing a presentation out at the Sanibel Library. I'll talk about that later, but his help with the signers, a few of them, of the Declaration of Independence. I knew who they were. But since he's working on a presentation at the same time, we're kind of working together. Adams and Franklin persuaded a 33-year-old Jefferson to take the lead on writing the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to talk more about that later. There he is. He's a young man. That is not him, I believe, at 33. And he wrote the first draft between June 11th and June 28th. That is rented quarters in Philadelphia. He drew heavily on his own previous drafts. It undergoes 86 edits. And he uses the Virginia Constitution, the Declaration of Rights, and the philosophy of John Locke. 86 edits. What changed? Congress cut out a lot, and they're the ones that make the heaviest edits. I'll talk more about that, including an impassioned cause that blamed King George for perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade. Jefferson did not like those revisions. In fact, at one point, I've read that he gets a little salty. How would you like it? There's nothing wrong with editing, but it just means a lot happened. Did it make for a better document? Some of it, but some of the things that were cut and some things that were never put in there would have been even better. But as I said, I'll talk more about that. Benjamin Franklin was the editor. He doesn't make that many edits, but ones he does are extremely important. His changes were believed to have been minimal, but when the document went before the entire Congress, the draft was more thoroughly changed by a larger body. The larger body, imagine 56 people, even if they're not all there at the same time, but a good chunk of them making edits. Yeah, that's what I think too. The final document was passed on July 2nd and ratified on July 4th. And the war, I said 1781, 1783, excuse me, my math. I couldn't even add 8, and that's what I used to do was math. 1783, the war ends. with the Treaty of Paris. 8 years of war. The Civil War is 4 years. John Adams was the driving force behind the American push for independence. He served on the Committee of Five. He nominated Jefferson to do it. I know later on things are not good between them and they become political enemies, but at the end they reconcile again. He spent months leading the radical faction, convincing his peers that a complete break with Great Britain was necessary. He's on that drafting committee, a committee of five: Jefferson, Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston and Adams. Persuading Jefferson, Adams insisted that Jefferson write the original draft because he had the best writing skills and he was from Virginia. And we'll talk more about that. John Hancock, he was the first to sign. He is a patriot. He's the president of Congress, but never president of the United States. He signed it alone in the center before other delegates added their names, and you'll find out that he signs it, the original first copy, and the secretary signs it, Thompson. And he signed, there was legend that he wrote his name extra large so that King George could read it without his spectacles, but this is probably not true. It's just kind of word of mouth because he was the first one. Remember that first copy? He's the only one except for the secretary. So he made it large, and that's what people call today putting on your John Hancock. Oh, here's Samuel Adams. He did a lot more than just I hope he's known for more than his lager. He was an American founding father. He was part of that group that organized the tea being dumped over the side of the ship in Boston, the Sons of Liberty. He wasn't there. He's more of an organizer. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress. He wanted to sever ties with Great Britain. And he'll sign the Declaration on August 2nd. He did a lot of organizing. Did he show up at these things? You'll find he did not. And by the way, John Adams didn't even know that what they called the Tea Party, dumping the tea, which did not belong to them. It belonged to the Brits, but they were sending a message because of all the taxes. But anyways, Samuel Adams, isn't it funny? The Boston Brewing Company, I believe, are the people that started this and made Samuel Adams much more well known. I guess his father wasn't a brewer, but he had something to do. I can't remember the right word, but he was something to do in the early phases of making lager. He was not a brewer, but he was a maltster. That's the right word. He could have been his father in the brewing business, and Adam probably was. And by the way, over time, Adam has problems like everybody else does, perhaps financial issues. But he is a patriot. He is an organizer. Here we have a great picture. On June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee from Virginia introduced a resolution that these united colonies are and ought to be free and independent states. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, along with Ben Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman, were entrusted with creating the Declaration of Independence. Adams believed that Jefferson should be the one to write it and explained to Jefferson why he was the one chosen. You've heard some of this, but I want you to hear what exact quote: "You are Virginian, and Virginia ought to appear at the head of this business. I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. And most important, you can write 10 times better than I can." Knowing to choose the right person, that is a good thing. Virginia's Declaration of Rights was one of the things used by Jefferson for the opening paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. It was copied by other colonies and became the basis of the Bill of Rights. Written by George Mason, it was adopted by the Virginia Constitutional Convention on June 12, 1776, and James Madison and Patrick Henry served on the drafting committee. So think about that, used for the opening paragraphs. Jefferson greatly admired a 47-page pamphlet by Thomas Paine, published anonymously, called Common Sense. Paine was born and raised in England and had been in Philadelphia for just over a year. Arguing against reconciliation with the monarchy, Paine wrote that the world at large, they have but little opportunity of knowing its true interest. The book sold more than 500,000 copies during the Revolutionary War and was cited by Jefferson and others as a major influence on the Declaration. And yeah, my husband, I think he's been reading it. He has a copy of it. I have to be honest, I have not read it currently. And this is just wanted to show you what some of the Declaration look like. I'll show it to you again. And they believe that some partial drafts and some other pages are missing. But Jefferson would make edits. Some things you can tell. They believe the bold, heavy lines, I believe, might be Franklin, but all those edits are made on that one page. So it is very difficult to know who did what. He didn't always mark. Sometimes they just kind of have to figure out based on the kind of edit it was. And most of them are made by the group as a whole. The delegates didn't want anything close to a full-fledged democracy. Isn't that something? In the modern sense, which they feared could lead to anarchy. Their vision would exclude Blacks, women, poor whites who didn't own property, Native Americans, and there were others. They believed in a form of what would be called elitism, but not one controlled by a monarch in parliament, in which they were not members. Ousting a monarchy was the first goal, and Jefferson would be called upon to list the grievances and legal justification. Jefferson had written about how he believed the Native Americans were in mind and body equal to the white man, while saying Black people might not be so. But as his attack on Americans in the Declaration demonstrated, that did not mean they would have the same rights as white people, and not just white people, white men. He believed that Native Americans could be part of American society if they adopted his belief, became farmers, adopted Christian principles, which is interesting to me because he certainly did not have belief in Christianity, and desired certain lands for white people. In effect, the Declaration of Independence meant that the United States did not recognize the proclamation line of other British measures designed to protect Native American land, and many tribes joined forces with London to fight the Americans. This further drove Jefferson to become one of the most aggressive leaders in calling for the removal of Indians. And this is from an article about Jefferson, Declaration of Independence, published last year. But it is true. Jefferson, I urge you to go visit his home. You will learn a lot about him. They do a great job talking about, Jefferson's a brilliant man, but there's a lot of conflicts in him, and he's certainly very human and makes some major mistakes when it comes to enslaved people as well. The Declaration doesn't mention rights for women, despite a March 1776 letter from Abigail Adams, who I think is an amazing woman, to her husband, John. There's also a great movie out there that came out over 20 years ago, maybe like 25, called Adams. She said to him, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." And realize Abigail was left back in Massachusetts a lot of the time, raising her children. And I'm going to tell you what John says back. "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We've been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy, I won't blot it out. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they're a little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. There's more. Massachusetts Historical Society has their letters. I urge you to go visit. They have a good website and read about that. John Adams was not a supporter of enslavement of humans, but you will see what happens. But he certainly wasn't one, including women, even at the request of his wife. And here's another copy of that picture of the Declaration. So this is interesting. Jefferson wrote that the compromise to achieve the unanimous Declaration of Independence explained the contradiction of a nation based on the idea that all men are created equal while perpetuating the practice of slavery. And that is from the website of his home. Congress deleted an entire paragraph that Jefferson condemned the slave trade while blaming the king. Sure, started there, but the patriots, they could have ended it, but they didn't. And that is the one thing that I will tell you, that was the big, there were people that did not want that part taken out, but Georgia, South Carolina would not have supported the Declaration of Independence. So what would you have done? Jefferson marked everything on the same set of manuscript pages, which he labeled the original rough draft, spelled like a draft, like you're having something to drink. There are quite a few changes in his handwriting. Some of those may have been changes Jefferson made before he showed the draft to anyone else, or perhaps in an early period when he showed it to John Adams. Other changes must reflect the committee members' review, but apart from those marked by Adams and Benjamin Franklin, they are all in Jefferson's handwriting, and he did not mark who suggested them. And there's the committee of 5. It's believed there were 86 changes. I don't know how 56 people can work together to edit. On July 2nd, the Lee Resolution was adopted by 12 of the 13 colonies. Remember, Richard Henry Lee is the one that came up with this idea to begin with. New York did not vote because they believed they lacked the authority from the colony's provincial Congress. Immediately afterwards, Congress began to discuss the Declaration. Congress made some changes and deletions to it on July 2nd, 3rd, and the morning of the 4th. But think about it, on July 2nd is when it's adopted. Later in the morning of July 4th, the Declaration was officially adopted, and the Committee of 5 took the manuscript copy of the document to John Dunlop, the official printer to Congress. And that original one just had this, well, it'll tell you. On the morning of July 5th, copies printed by John Dunlap were dispatched by members of Congress to various committees and assemblies and to commanders of the Continental troops. On July 9th, the Declaration was officially approved by the New York Convention. The document was signed by most of the members on August 2nd. And I thought I had mentioned it, probably I will later, that originally it was just Hancock and Thompson. But listen to this. The document was signed by most members on August 2nd, but they declare independence on July 2nd. George Wythe signed on August 27th. On September 4th, Richard Henry Lee, Elbridge Gerry, And Oliver Wolcott signed. Matthew Thornton signed on November 19th. He's from New Hampshire. And Thomas McKeon signed in 1781. 56 members signed, but each colony only had one vote, and it went by majority. So, though you see that picture of them all signing, it really didn't happen like that. And by the way, what gave me the idea to do this was that I went to the theater. The Southwest Florida Symphony did the musical 1776. And of course, there's some things that aren't true, but it was really interesting and it made me think. After the Declaration had been adopted, the committee took to Dunlop the manuscript document. We think maybe it was Jefferson's fair copy of his rough draft, and I spelled it the more traditional way. On the morning they were dispatched, they were given to people. The Declaration was inserted into the rough journal of Continental Congress. The text was followed by the words, signed by the order in behalf of Congress, John Hancock, President, attest. Charles Thompson, Secretary. It is not known how many copies John Dunlop printed on his busy night of July 4th. There are 26 copies known to exist, but there were probably quite a few more printed. And this is called the Dunlop Broadside. 21 owned by American institutions, 2 by British institutions, and 3 by private owners. And one place I read that they think there was actually 200 copies printed. So it's still possible that one of you could find it. And there's the one that was just those 2 signatures without everyone else's signature. And that is in the National Archives. By 1820, the Declaration of Independence was showing signs of age. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, commissioned printer William J. Stone to make a full-size copper plate engraving. This plate was used to print copies of the Declaration. The 1823 Stone engraving is the most frequently reproduced version of the Declaration. And there are all those signatures, but remember, they didn't all occur at one time. And did you know that there were 6 people that signed the Declaration and also the Constitution? Franklin, George Reed, Roger Sherman, Committee of 5 as well, Robert Morris, George Clymer, and James Wilson. And somebody, here's a question. So what happens if you find one of those lost broadsides? Somebody bought one in 1989, paid $4 for it. That version of the Declaration was eventually acquired by Norman Lear, the one that produced All in the Family, for $8,100,000. Another little interesting tidbit I want to share. It says that in her 1997 book, Pauline Myers, about the Declaration, said that no member of Congress recalled in July 1777 that it was almost a year since they had declared their freedom from the British. So nobody said, oh, we got to make July 4th. It's the anniversary of signing or ratifying, but it wasn't. But the Declaration of Independence. Nobody thought about it. They finally remembered on July 3rd, because remember, it actually starts on July 2nd. And July 4th became the day that seemed to make the most sense for celebrating independence. The Declaration wasn't always respected because there's the feud that, then the feuding starts between Adams, who's a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, who's a Republican at the time. The Declaration and its anniversary day weren't widely celebrated until the Federalists traded away from the political scene in 1812. And did you know that the Declaration and the Constitution were both hidden away during World War II after Pearl Harbor until they were in Fort Knox, and they stayed there until 1944, excuse me. I'm having a hard time with my dates today. And did you ever see the movie National Treasure? There really is a secret message on the back of the Declaration. That's a whole device about the movie, but on the back it's written Original Declaration of Independence dated 4th July 1776. They think it's a label that was added later, but not like when it was in storage, perhaps. So here's a line, because there's a amazing little book that my husband is reading that I read too, called The Greatest Sentence Ever Written. And it's about this sentence. So this is how Jefferson originally wrote it at the top here. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable. Doesn't sound quite the same, does it? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and independent, that from the equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The self-evident part apparently was put in by Benjamin Franklin. Let's go down here again. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This is what we know today, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with inherent and inalienable rights. You can see the changes here. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they believe, most likely, that John Adams is the one that put in the part about they are endowed by their Creator with inherent, because Jefferson did not have traditional, he was a deist. They said that Adams had more traditional religious views. He was most likely a universalist. Most likely he put that in there. But look how this changed over time. But Princeton has something that shows all the changes that they believe that they can track that happened to the Declaration of Independence in the whole document. Is this a legally binding document? No. But is it a statement to Great Britain? Is it a statement to the world that they're not going to be beholden to a king? I didn't get to I read the Civil War Monitor every month. There are some really interesting articles in here. That's about 5 of them about the overlap, the inspiration, the patriots, how the American Revolution inspired the Union and the Confederacy. And if you're interested in that, as I was, since I didn't want to give you an hour-long presentation, well, I do want to give you an hour long. I didn't want to give you 3 hours long, but I was going to mention some of the articles to see if it would be of interest to you. And it's called The Patriots. Civil War historians weigh in on how the American Revolution inspired both the Union and the Confederacy. The Last Men, the Civil War testimony of the last revolutionary veterans. Yes, there were some still alive, which is amazing to me. Irreconcilable Constitutions, Abraham Lincoln versus Jefferson Davis on the meaning of freedom. And that starts back with our Declaration and Loyalists and Unionists, comparing internal dissent and America's 2 greatest conflicts. And there is a lot of overlap. And Southern Yankee Doodles, the American Revolution and Confederate culture, and Fighting for the Father of the Republic, celebrating George Washington's birthday and the Union armies. So a lot of articles, and gonna learn, that could be a whole other topic. Here's a copy of this book. It's that one sentence. It's a little, if it was published in a different form, we'd call it a pamphlet. But I think it's worth buying. It's on sale on Amazon right now. I would urge you to get a copy. 1776 was that the Americans decisively turned on monarchism and embraced constitutional representative government as the basis for their liberty and happiness. This required independence. In 1776, a rebellion for rights by willing subjects of British colonies became a revolution for freedom by people who wanted their own republican government run by them. And we are a republic, focusing on battles just as much that mattered in 1776 and still matters today. Simply put, that in the United States, the people would reign and their elected representatives would rule. And that's from the Atlantic. And yes, the Declaration of Independence is a flawed document. It leaves out people that didn't own property. It leaves out women, it leaves out Blacks, it leaves out Native Americans, it pretty much leaves out everybody except for white men. So those are the flaws, but what it does do is serve as a guiding light in the start of the road that leads to all those things that should have been added in the beginning. Do I wish it had happened then? I do. But it is one of the greatest documents ever written. It doesn't have legal power, but it certainly has inspiration, and it will lead to our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. On Friday, please join Spencer when he talks about Hiram Maxim and the overlap with Thomas Edison. Who's Hiram Maxim? Well, you'll have to come on here, sign up for it at 10:30. Next month, I am doing George Washington just as a soldier, and that's still a broad topic. And was he really responsible for starting the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War? And remember, then we'll have an 8 Years' War, which I need to remember, 1775 to 1883. And then we will have a Civil War, 1861 to 1865. I thank you for your support, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Bye-bye.